Hello, friends. My name is Steve, and we're here today with Benedict Jacka. Benedict, thank you so much for making time for me.
No problem. Good to be here.
Nice. Yeah, I know you're a busy person, so I appreciate you taking time out of your day. But for those people who aren't familiar with you or your work, can you tell us about it?
Yeah, I'm an urban fantasy author now, at least. I've I've written books in a few different genres over the years, but ever since about 2012, which was when my Alex Verus series first came out, that's been the niche I've fit into. And 2012 was when the Alex Verus series came out. There were 12 books in that. 2021 was where it ended. That was where the 12th book came out. And I'm just starting a new urban fantasy series in about 3 weeks, actually, is when the first book in that comes out, October the 5th or October the 10th, depending which side of the Atlantic you're.
Yeah. What is that like when you have a book that you're working on for so long and you send it off, and the period in between, what is that like to be so engaged with something and then just wait the waiting period?
It's a holiday, really, but a holiday that I often quite need, because I tend to be pretty tired by the time I finish a book. I don't really take much time off while I'm working on a book. For the 6, 7, 8 months or whatever that I'm working on it, I'll usually go pretty much 7 days a week. So by the time I finally finish it and I send it off, I'm really exhausted. So the first few weeks after I do send it off, I'm mostly just collapsing and recharging.
I bet. Do you have, so you said you usually write 7 days a week. Do you have a writing goal, or is it just whatever happens that day happens?
I try and maintain about a page a day. That's around 500 words-ish. 500 words a day is about 15,000 a month, which means if I can keep that up for 6 months, then that's about 90,000 in 6 months, and 90,000 to 100,000 is about the length of one of my books. So a page a day is what I shoot for. Sometimes I'll get more done, sometimes I'll get less done. If I get less, I'll try and push myself to do a bit more to catch up.
Do you feel pressure to write the 500, or are there some days when you just don't feel like writing at all, and do you just take that day off, or do you try to maintain that 500?
I do feel pressured. I mean, there are lots of days where I don't get anything done, but that's less a case of me taking the day off and more a case of me just getting stuck or having trouble for whatever reason. And it usually tends to make me a little bit annoyed or stressed afterwards.
Yeah.
So I'm generally a lot happier when the writing's making progress.
Yeah. You mentioned, the 12-book series. What was that like finishing a 12-book series? That's a long journey.
I didn't really notice anything at the time. It's because it's such a big, large job that you're too close to it to really register it. It's like building something that's several miles long. You can't really see it because you're just up close, putting down one brick at a time. It's only afterwards, when you step back and look at the whole thing, that you get a bit of a sense of what it looks like as a whole.
Yeah, $12. Did you know how the series would end when you started it, or did you just did you have it plotted out?
No, when I wrote the first one, I wasn't expecting it to be a series, and I wasn't really expecting it to get published at all.
Yeah, I know. I read that you had, the first few books you had written were focused on a younger protagonist, and you tried to have a more of an adult protagonist. Is that what made you decide to try the different approach?
Well, I actually started out as a children's fantasy author. Then the books that I got published with were children's rather than children's fantasy. and then but after those ones were failures, commercially speaking. So my publisher dropped me after that, and they rejected the next thing I sent them, and then the next thing after that got rejected, and then the next few things after that also got rejected. So when I wrote the book that would turn into Fated, which was the first book in the Alex Verus series, that was the 10th book I'd ever written, and it was following up on 4 books in a row that had all been rejected. So by the time I sat down to write Fated, I really wasn't thinking in terms of a series. I was thinking in terms of, hey, maybe if I'm very lucky, this one might get published, but probably not. But then Fated got picked up, but even then it wasn't picked up necessarily for a series. It was for a 3-book contract. I rewrote Fated and then wrote Cursed and Taken, which were books 2 and 3. And I knew there were going to be 3 books, but I didn't know if there were going to be any more beyond that.
Wow.
So it was only after that when I got a contract offer for books 4 and 5. When I sat down to write books 4 and 5, that I started seriously thinking about the direction the series was going to go
in. For someone going through the same thing about having your series not picked up, and then you submit work and it gets rejected, what advice would you offer to people who are experiencing the same thing? What kept you going through that time period?
I think you really have to be doing it because you want to. Looking back on it, if I'd been trying to become a successful author, I would have given up and dropped it a long, long time ago. I actually did kind of drop it towards the end, just because I was starting to feel I couldn't afford to keep on spending time on it anymore. But I didn't actually realize at the time when I was starting out just how bad the odds were. The fraction of authors who ever become professional ones, much less full-time ones, is vanishingly small. It's sub 1%. I think it's somewhere in the order of about 1 in 1,000, something like that. So probably, if I was giving advice to my younger self, it would be to tell my younger self, you realize this, you should probably know this very likely is not going to work out, so make sure you have a day job.
Oh. Yeah, it's to spend so much time on something and then to have it rejected must be soul crushing in a way. I would imagine it'd be tough.
It was a bit, yeah. Because I got a lot of rejections. It was spread out. I mean, the first book book 1 that I wrote was rejected. But I think it did get me some interest from an agent. Book 2 also never got published, but did get me an agent. Book 3 also got rejected, and book 4 got published. But in a way, that wasn't so bad. It was difficult to deal with, but I could handle it. What was really hard was when books 4 and 5 were accepted and were published, and then they were failures. That was very hard to handle. It's one thing to keep on plugging away at something and trying over and over again in the hope that eventually you're going to get a break and eventually going to have some success. If you've had that success and then failed afterwards and then basically been dumped by your publisher, then going back and trying again is when it gets really hard.
Oh, yeah, must be tough. When did you start writing?
Last year in secondary school, I think. So I would have been about 18, 19, something like that. But that was when I started writing an actual novel. I'd written stories before that, but lots of children write stories. That doesn't really mean anything. But I did, while I was in the last year of school, I started writing something that turned into 100,000 word novel, and so that's probably the point at which I'd say I started.
Nice. And what is it about stories that appeals to you? A good story. What does that mean to you?
I don't know. I've just always been kind of obsessed with them. My father told me that I was sort of obsessed with stories from when I was only 1 or 2 years old. I'd always pester him to tell me stories, and I'd always want to read stories and watch stories and play games with stories and so on. It's just always what I was obsessed with. And so when I was the whole time, I spent much of my childhood reading books, pretty much all fiction. And by the time, and I would just read fiction endlessly. By the time I got to 18, I'd spent more time reading than most people do in their entire lives.
Do you have any favorite books that you read in your childhood that stood out to you?
Yeah, my two favorites when I was young were Watership Down and The Lord of the Rings.
Can't go wrong with those, right?
There were lots of books I'd read over and over, but those ones I think I must have read about 10 times or so each.
Was Lord of the Rings an influence on you later in life, even when you started to write your own fantasy book?
Oh yeah, but I think most of the books one reads influence you one way or another. Lord of the Rings did have a big impact, but I wouldn't be able to point to any one thing and say this was where it came from. It's just that it's more accurate just to say that it was one of my favorite books, so I read it over and over again. And so just sort of internalized it, I guess.
You mentioned you're most well known for your urban fantasy books. Have you thought about writing a different genre, or have you tried to?
I did before I got published. My first book was children's fantasy. 2 and 3 were children's fantasy. 4 and 5 were children's non-fantasy. Number 6 was sort of semi-adult non-fantasy coming of age thing. Then a couple more were children's fantasy again, and then I did a science fiction one. And it was only for book number 10 that I made the switch to urban fantasy with an adult protagonist. And I think that was kind of just a case of experimenting back and forth to see what worked. And audiences, and I had the most success with urban fantasy. Audiences seemed to like it the most, and I quite liked doing it. So it was less a case of me wanting to switching away from urban fantasy. It was more that urban fantasy was what I hit on after trying quite a few other things.
Nice. How do you, with fantasy, it's such the genre is so wide. There's so many things you can do with it. But when you build a fantasy world, how do you build a world, like a fantasy world, and present it to the reader? Is there a method that you use when you're introducing a world to a reader?
Yeah, with a new series, the way I think of it is that a new series, a new story, particularly if it's the first book in the series, one of the ideas of the book is that the book works as a sort of guided tour, where you're getting to see how the world works, the players, what the feeling is like, the different concepts and the ideas and things like that. So that's one of the things that tends to shape the first book in a series. It'll be as a way to present the world.
And for characters, what makes a character compelling to you, or how do you create a compelling character?
Not sure most of the time. I just try different things and see what works. I don't really have a formula that I follow. I suppose for a protagonist character, I'll just try to write one that I know I'd like to enjoy reading and I'd like to enjoy following.
When you are writing, we talked before we started recording about it being a solitary. It can be solitary. Is there anyone that you kind of like throw ideas after, or you ask for feedback as you're writing, or kind of to get their input?
I try sometimes, but while I'm actually writing, I've never had much success with that. I can't remember who said it, but an old piece of advice I once heard was that you should write with the door closed and rewrite with the door open. So it's usually after I've done the first draft, then I'll start going to other people. And over time, I've developed a beta reader group that I'll show my stuff to after I've done a bit. So that's usually the pattern. I'll keep it to myself to begin with, and then after I've got a section of maybe 15,000 words or so, then I'll start showing it to people.
Okay. When you say you have a group of beta readers, what do you look for in a beta reader? What kind of feedback are you looking for from a beta reader?
It depends. With beta reading, I actually have a sort of canned speech and email that I send out to beta readers when they first join the group, and mostly what I'm looking for is emotional reaction. I do really like it if I can find analytical beta readers who will go into detail about what they felt about a section and characters and story and so on and why. But mostly what I'm looking for from them is just immediate gut level reaction, because that's what I'm going to get from an actual reader. When somebody picks up the book in a bookshop or looks at it online, they're not going to think about it in depth. They're just going to make a snap judgment on whether they like it or not. And so that's the kind of reaction I'm looking for from beta readers as well. Just, did you like it? Did you not like it?
Yeah, there's a big. It's always been a debate, I guess, but about reviews. As if I were writing, I'd have trouble reading my own reviews. I would be. I don't know if I'd be able to handle it. Do you read your own reviews? And if you do, what do you look for in reviewers, or what feedback do you take from them?
I actually read pretty much all of them. I've read, I don't know how many thousands of reviews of my stuff by now. Particularly when I was starting out, I read absolutely everything. And some people say that's a bad idea, and certainly sometimes you don't get anything good from it. But the way I see it is that it's just feedback. Sometimes it's good feedback, sometimes it's bad feedback. But if you want to get better, you do want to hear what people have to say about it. What did I think? Oddly enough, I tended to find that good reviews and bad reviews tended to be... I think I tended to find that mixed reviews were the most useful. Good reviews were second best, and bad reviews were the worst. Bad reviews tended to be... There's this weird thing where when people are giving a good review of something, they'll tell you everything they loved about it. And they're usually very open about what they like. But I don't know why, it's kind of strange, but when people give bad reviews, a lot of the time they're not particularly honest. You'd think that if they were just slating something, then they would be completely upfront about everything they hated about it. But I've come to realize over the years that an awful lot of the time people won't tell you the truth about why they hated something. They'll tell you that they hated it, and they'll tell you the truth about that part, but they won't tell you the truth about why. It's odd, but it does seem to be the case.
That is odd. Do you have any ideas why that might be?
I think because quite often the reason people really hate something tends to be because of the theme. They don't like the thematic aspects, and they often aren't willing to actually say why. Like they were, or just some aspect of who the protagonist is, and so on. So I think quite often people aren't willing to openly say, this person is from X class, race, and gender, and so I hate them because of that reason.
It's kind of an odd reason to dislike a whole book for one character's traits.
It's a pretty common one, honestly. An awful lot of my negative reviews come down to some combination of not liking the protagonist's identity. That describes a lot of them. And yeah, it's been a while since I thought about it, so I can't. I do remember noticing other patterns with it, but I can't remember what they were right now. But then at other times, I get really useful reviews that do actually have quite valuable feedback, and of the most useful. Often the sort of mixed ones where they'll say the things they liked and the things they didn't like so much tend to be the most helpful ones. It's very scattershot because it's all very colored by the person's biases and opinions. But if you read a lot of them, you do actually end up painting a picture over time. Like I do consistently notice the things that some people complain about, and the things that other things that people especially like, and so on.
Yeah, not only people's personal biases and feelings, but also because you can read a book today and you can, whether you like it or dislike it, and you can read it again a month from now, and depending on your own state of mind or what you're out with your environment is, or whatever it may be, you can view it in a whole different light. So it all depends on when they read it too. They might just be having a bad go of it.
Yeah, that happens, and that goes both ways. Sometimes people will seem to hate one of my books for no particular reason. Other times they'll gush about it and say they love it. But if I look at the reasons, it's hard to see how I really deserve the praise they're giving. So I think that kind of thing, it cancels out. But it's like a sort of it's the wisdom of crowds thing, like the thing where if you ask one person to guess the number of beans in the jar or something, they'll get it wrong. And if you ask two people, they'll get it wrong. But if you ask about 500 people and average out all of their guesses together, the number often ends up turning out to be surprisingly accurate. So that I tend to find it's similar to that with reviews. You get an awful lot of useless ones, but if you read all of them and you average them all together, then you often find it does paint a picture, and certain things do consistently get picked up on. So
that makes sense.
So who knows? Maybe I'll I'm still a relatively young author as far as this goes. So maybe as I get older and spend less time in the business, then I'll gradually start to pay less and less attention to reviews. But I'm still at the stage where I do pay a reasonable amount of attention to them.
Yeah, I'm kind of surprised to hear you say that you read all or most of them, because you have quite a few reviews for all your books. You have quite a lot of them.
It's just a sort of routine thing where every day or two I'll just log into my author page on Goodreads and see what the most recent reviews are, and see what's cropped up, that kind of thing. And I'll do Google searches on my name to see if anybody's saying anything. Again, most of the time it's not. You don't really get anything useful. You'll just either get empty stuff that's ego boosting, or empty stuff that's just mean and makes you feel bad. But that from time to time you do get quite useful bits of critique, and you do get very specific bits of advice on what aspects of your writing people like and what aspects annoy people, and what they're drawn to, and what you're recommended as on the basis of, and so on.
And you mentioned being a relatively young author still. How much has the industry changed since you began publishing?
Since I began publishing, it's a bit hard for me to tell, since I haven't been around in it that long. I first got published in 2012, and so it's been 10 years or so. So it's hard for me to disentangle how the industry has changed from just my own journey as an author. Main thing I've noticed is that most of the new authors who started out at the same time as me have fallen away and dropped out and disappeared. Whereas most of the authors who have stuck around are ones who were already established at the beginning.
Yeah,
I don't know if that's anything new.
It can be a tough business.
It's just generally the way the business works. There are quite a few long-lasting people, but generally the long-lasting ones are the ones who were lasting to begin with. So, like when I went to a few conventions back in the early days, around 2012 and 2013, something like that, and there are quite a few people I met back then who are still around, but they're pretty much all people who were established already. Whereas pretty much all of the new people I met, the ones who were other debut authors who were just starting out at the same time as me, they're all gone for one reason or another. I'm not sure if I can think of a single other author who started at the same time as I did, whom I made friends with, who's still around.
Wow.
It's just an industry with a very high attrition rate. I have heard lots of people claim that it's much harder for a new author or for mid-list authors than it has been in the past, but I don't know if that's true or not, because if you read a lot of the 20th century, the ones who in 20th century science fiction fantasy authors who are now famous, quite a lot of them, if you look at their publishing history, had a really tough time of it. And these were ones who were very successful and persistent. But there are quite a few cases of them being constantly broke and so on.
Yeah. One of the biggest changes, I think, we may not be seeing it quite yet. We're starting to get a little bit of it, but what are your thoughts on artificial intelligence?
Bit of a misnomer at the moment. I've seen a lot of things that are referred to as AI. They don't strike me as anything like the strong artificial intelligences that I've read about in science fiction, and they don't look like they could become the strong artificial intelligences that you see in science fiction. What we have is a vast amount of pattern recognition and pattern regurgitation programs. You just feed in a few million instances of data, and it chews them all up and spits out something that resembles all the things it's chewed up.
Yeah, it's pretty. It'll be interesting to see how it progresses or doesn't over the next year or two.
But I've seen. If you mean things like AI generated writing, I'm assuming that's what you're talking about. I do remember reading the sort of stuff that ChatGPT or whatever it's called has put out. I think the main thing that I remember occurring to me was that there were certain types of writing that it could actually replicate as well as the humans, and that wasn't a compliment to the AI. That was a judgment on the humans. The kind of people that it could replace are the ones who were putting out stuff that was basically them trying to be machines in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
At the moment, at least, it seems like AI-generated writing can replace certain human-generated writing, but only by the sort of humans who are trying to be machines in the first place.
Yes. I spoke with Michael J. Sullivan recently. He said the exact same thing. So it's interesting. Yeah. Speaking of writing, what inspires you?
Not sure. Pretty much everything, probably. I think, like a lot of writers, I just use my own life as raw material for everything. So anything that I spend a lot of time on that I'm familiar with tends to get reused in my books and stories somehow or other.
Do you find that to be therapeutic?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think pretty much any writer or artist who's any good, they use their own art as a form of self-therapy, as a way of working through things.
Yeah, it's with your you said you have a certain writing goal every day. Do you have a creative process or a routine that you do every day that you kind of begin your day with?
Oh, no, not really. I'll have a certain amount of words, a certain amount of pages that I'll try and hit per day, but I'm fairly flexible about when I do it. Sometimes it'll be done early, sometimes it'll be done late, but it doesn't matter too much exactly when.
Yeah. It's nice having that freedom of just when you feel inspired to do it.
It's less a matter of inspiration all the time and more like a matter of hitting your head against a wall until something works. Because a lot of the time when I'm sitting down to write, it's not because I'm feeling inspired. I just really want to get something done and don't particularly want to do it at all. It's every now and again you're feeling really inspired and it just comes naturally, but that's not very often, honestly. Most of the time, usually what's much more common I find is you can get yourself into a sort of flow state where it feels quite natural and comfortable, but it takes a lot of work to get yourself into that state. It's never that easy.
Interesting. And if a new author who's starting out now came to you for advice, what advice would you give to them?
About what, the business side of it or the creative side of it?
Either side.
I don't know. It's a bit of a big topic, honestly.
Yeah.
I'd probably hope for that. I'd probably shoot it back to them and ask, can you give me like a more specific question? Because I can't really distill the whole thing down to one easy soundbite. Like
I guess to be specific, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. No, but go ahead. Basically, like if they were struggling, I'd probably try and find out if there was one thing in particular they were struggling with and ask what that thing was.
I guess to be specific, one of the questions I see most often is how to market yourself and market your work.
Oh, that is something I've actually thought about quite a bit. I wrote to the point where I wrote a sort of short mini series on my website about it. I don't know how useful it'll be, but short version is if you're worrying too much about marketing, you're going down the wrong tree. You do have to market yourself to some degree, but the problem with just how do I market myself is if you're trying to be successful by marketing yourself, you're competing against a gigantic pool of other authors and other creative types who are all doing the exact same thing. So trying to self-market and trying to frantically churn and grind and get engagement and work on social media and so on. It's not that you can't do it, you can, but you have to realize that everybody else out there is trying the exact same thing as you, the exact same way. So either you have to be good enough at it that you're better than or as good as the best of them, or you have to have some edge that they don't. And in my case, I came to the conclusion fairly fast that I was never going to be successful by being a better marketer than everyone else, because there are lots of other people who can do the online marketing thing better than I can.
So instead of focusing on that, what did you focus on? What would be a better use of their time, if not that, in the marketing or what would you recommend they work on?
I can only say I don't know what. Short answer is play to your strengths. If you happen to be somebody who has really got a talent for marketing, then sure, go for that. There are some people who can do that. They are just the natural grinder types who are fine with going at it day after day after day and grinding for engagement. I'm not that sort of person, and I realized quickly that was never going to work for me. So in my case, what I decided to focus on was just on quality of story. I'm not particularly good as a social media manager, but I am pretty good at writing stories that make people want to find out what happens next. So so the loop, I suppose, I got into was write a book, try and get it published, read people's feedback on it, improve based on that, then write another book, and keep on with that cycle, going round and round, trying to write better and better and better stories, and trying to improve to the point where people enjoyed my stuff enough that when they read it, they'd like it and they'd seek out more books by me and they'd recommend it to other people. And that was eventually how I got successful. But again, that worked for me. I don't know if it would necessarily work for everyone else. But but like I said, it's a case of playing to your strengths. So I guess that would be my advice to a new author: figure out what you're good at and go for that.
You mentioned keeping the reader engaged and wanting them to know what happens next. How do you keep the reader engaged over the course of a long series?
I don't know, honestly. That's one of those things where I've always had some natural skill at it. My very early beta readers, they used to say that even with my early stuff, even though it was often clumsy as hell or badly written, one thing I did always have some innate talent at was making the reader want to go to the next page. So I've always just tried to focus on that. I suppose if there's one thing I've tried to work on as far as that goes, it's cutting out extraneous stuff.
And what do you enjoy reading?
Very varied stuff nowadays. I actually don't read in my own genre very much, for instance. So I'll read all kind. I used to. It used to be a case where the stuff I write now is the sort of stuff I used to read obsessively 5 or 10 years ago. But I don't actually read stuff in my own genre very much. I'm much more likely to read stuff from way out there, something completely different. I find that's more likely to get me interesting ideas. I do still read some science fiction fantasy, but not specifically in the urban fantasy genre.
What was the last thing that you read with your own time that you really enjoyed, that really blew you away?
Last thing I read that I really had fun with, probably the Dungeon Crawler Carl series by Matt Dinman. That one's really fun. He's been putting those out quite frequently. First one was published a few years ago, and he's up to book number 6 in the series, I think now. That's the most recent one. That's it. I found that a lot of the more interesting stuff nowadays is I don't know exactly how you describe it, but not traditionally published anyway. Put it that way. Either tends to be either stuff that goes straight to the Kindle store, or just straight web fiction that doesn't even get to the Kindle store, that just starts out as a story on Royal Road or something like that.
Yeah, a lot of great self-published books out now. Do you listen to music while you write?
Not very often. Sometimes.
Do you have any favorites?
No, I've got a giant music collection which I've built up over the years, and I might just have that on in the background. But it's very varied. The way I do things is every time I like a song, I'll just put it on, add it to my collection. And if I'll put music on, it's usually just a mixture of all the stuff in my collection.
Do you have an album that you can listen to over and over again and never get tired of?
No. There've been a few times when I've really liked a particular album or something like that, but no, it would eventually get to the point where I'd get sick of it and want something different.
Yeah. There's just so much of it that it's hard to stick to one thing. I have a couple more questions for you. One of them was, what is something that your readers would be surprised to learn about you?
I don't know. To know that, I have to know what their image is of me in the first place. What would actually surprise them? I suppose, touching back on something we were saying earlier, they might be a bit surprised to realize just how much of the writing process is just hard, rather tedious work. I think people have this image of being a professional artist as being a more fun, carefree job than it actually is. But in reality, most of the days that I sit down to work, I'm still having to push myself a bit to do it, because it's not something I necessarily want to do right then. It's a very satisfying job, but that doesn't mean it's particularly casual or fun while you're actually doing it. You get occasional sections which are fun and easy to do, but for every one of those, 1 hour you spend like that, there are 3 or 4 more hours where you're just sort of pushing away at a giant rock and trying to roll it uphill.
That's a great way to describe it. Do you have any favorite family recipes?
Family recipes? Huh?
Mm-hmm.
Sort of. I've got a few of my own recipes. I've got just ones that I've worked on and perfected over time. I'm not sure I would call them family recipes, though, so much as more ones that I've practiced enough that I'm really comfortable with them. Like there's a roast beef recipe that I really like, but this is less a case of it being a family recipe as one I found one time and have made enough times now that I really like it. Likewise, I've got a couple of others that I guess are family
what is your favorite part of that?
What the recipe? Not even sure it qualifies that special. It's just roast beef with a paste you put over the top, which is a mixture of chopped garlic, olive oil, thyme, and salt and pepper. It's fairly basic, but I really like it, and everyone else seems to enjoy it. So it's just become my standard way of doing it.
Nice. So the last question I have for you is, what was your first job?
First one. When do I count the? If I don't count the volunteer work or working for my family or whatever, it was probably when I was working in the civil service. Mm-hmm. Back when I was in my gap year. That's a thing we have over here in the UK. Basically, you have a year in between school and university. I got a job working in the civil service, which is for the British government, and I managed to get to a position with an agency that places people in temporary jobs in various government departments. So I did that for, I think it was about 6 months, 9 months, something like in between that time. So it was just office grunt work. Interesting in its own way.
Are there things that you learned from that experience that you've taken with you?
Oh yeah, a lot. It gave me a bit of an image of it did teach me quite a lot about how the government works. That was interesting. That was that. Also learned a surprising amount about what makes a good boss or manager. Since I had a fairly bad boss in the first place I was working, and then a really good boss in the second place I was working at. So that's something I've always remembered since then.
What are some traits of a good manager?
So the guy I had working, who was my boss in the second place, we were working in a registry. I don't know if you know what that is. I guess in the UK in the US you might call it the mailroom, but it's not quite the same. It's the sort of entry point clearinghouse office for an office floor, so all documents get routed through there and so on. And my boss in there had this particular trait where if something needed doing, like if there was some long, tedious job, he wouldn't lecture me about doing it. He'd just say, right, we better get started on this job, and we'll just go over there and start work on it. And of course, every time he'd do that, I'd immediately feel like, okay, well, I better go help him then. And that always stuck with me. It was rather than it was just something that I always noticed. Somebody who's the kind of boss who jumps in and starts working on something on their own is a lot more pleasant to work under than the kind who just sits back and orders somebody else to do it instead.
Yeah, it's not always. Not everyone has those abilities to do that.
Is it? It was very simple. I suppose it wasn't just. It's that and some things I did at universities later on did actually made me realize as well. Being a boss, being in charge, what it actually means, if you're any good at it, it means that everything is your responsibility. So if anything, it just means that anything that needs to get done, it's your job either to make sure somebody else is doing it, or in the absence of that, do it yourself. And as a result, the number of people who actually want to be in charge is always much smaller than the number of management positions out there. There are lots of people who want the status of being in charge, but there are surprisingly few who actually want the responsibility of being in charge.
Yeah. Not everyone can be a good manager. I think it takes a certain personality to really thrive at it.
Yeah, but I always remembered that guy that I worked under. He was very good.
Yes. So you do have a book too of Inheritance of Magic. That's off to the publisher. When can we expect it?
About a year from now, I'm guessing. So I expect they're going to do a 1 a year-ish sort of release schedule. So I'd expect the second one to come out in autumn of next year, autumn 2024.
Nice. Awesome. Well, looking forward to it. And I want to thank you again for making time for me. I know you're busy and have a lot going on, and time zones are a thing, so I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me on here. It was nice talking with you.
Yeah. For anyone wanting to connect with you, where's the best place to find you and your work?
Either my website or my Twitter account. Well, they've started calling it X now, but yeah. So I check my Twitter account regularly, and my website is the best way to stay in touch with me because I put a blog post up pretty regularly every Friday morning.
Nice. Yeah, I'll be sure and link both of those in the show notes so anyone can click on there and go bother you. Awesome. Well, thank you again. I really appreciate it.
No problem. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you.